A man can ruin your life in less time than it takes to step off a train. Clara Whitlock learned that the hard way when she arrived in Ridgewater, Wyoming, with $14 and a fiancé who didn't exist. The town saw her as just another fool chasing promises across the frontier. They were half right. But what happened next? The boy who called her mama, the widowed rancher carrying ghosts, and the fire that nearly killed them all. That's the part nobody saw coming. If you want to know how a woman survives when everything falls apart, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The train lurched to a stop with a scream of brakes that sent Clara's trunk sliding forward and nearly crushed her foot. She grabbed the seat back, steadied herself, and looked out the window at what was supposed to be her future. Ridgewater, Wyoming looked like it had been built as an apology. A single dirt street ran between wooden storefronts that leaned into each other like drunks holding themselves upright. Dust rose in slow clouds from wagon wheels and horse hooves, and the sky stretched so wide and empty it made her chest hurt. Back in Philadelphia, the buildings had pressed close enough to block the sun. Here, there was nothing but space and heat and silence. Clara adjusted her hat, picked up her carpet bag, and stepped onto the platform. The heat hit her like something solid. It wasn't even noon yet. "Miss Whitlock?" She turned. A man in a conductor's uniform stood beside her trunk, which two other men were already hauling toward the edge of the platform. "Yes?" "Your luggage, ma'am. Where should we—" "I'm waiting for someone," Clara said. "He'll be here." The conductor glanced down the empty street, then back at her. "You sure about that?" "Quite sure." He tipped his hat and walked away, but Clara saw the look he exchanged with the baggage handler. She'd seen that look before, in her landlady's eyes when the rent was late, in her sister's face when Clara announced she was leaving Philadelphia to marry a man she'd only corresponded with through letters. Pity mixed with judgment, like watching someone walk into traffic. Clara set her bag down and waited. Edgar Holloway had written to her faithfully for 8 months. His letters had arrived every 2 weeks like clockwork, full of descriptions of his ranch, his cattle business, his plans for the future. He'd sent a photograph. A handsome man in his 30s standing beside a wagon, one hand shading his eyes from the sun. He'd asked her to marry him in April, and she'd said yes by return post. He'd sent money for the train ticket, told her to pack light, promised he'd be waiting at the station with a preacher and witnesses. She'd believed every word. 20 minutes passed, then 40. The platform emptied. A woman with 2 children walked past and stared at Clara like she was a piece of furniture left out in the weather. A man in a suit stepped off the next train, glanced at her, and kept walking. Clara opened her handbag and pulled out Edgar's last letter dated 3 weeks ago. "I'll be there Tuesday, noon train. Wear something nice. We'll be married by sundown." It was Tuesday. It was noon. She was wearing her best dress, the dove gray one with the lace collar that made her look older than 27. An hour passed. Clara sat down on her trunk, ankles crossed, hands folded in her lap. A gentleman didn't keep his bride waiting this long. An honest man didn't forget a commitment this important. But a con artist, well, a con artist took your money and disappeared like smoke. She opened her handbag again and counted what was left. $14.32. The train ticket had cost most of her savings. Edgar's generous contribution toward her travel expenses had covered the fare with nothing left over. Stupid. She'd been so desperately stupid. "You all right, miss?" Clara looked up. A shopkeeper stood in the doorway across the street, wiping his hands on an apron. "I'm fine," she called back. "You waiting on someone?" "Not anymore." She stood, brushed the dust off her skirt, and picked up her bag. Her trunk would have to stay where it was until she figured out what to do next. She crossed the street toward the row of storefronts, head high, spine straight, trying to look like a woman with a plan instead of a fool with $14. The shopkeeper watched her approach. "You looking for work?" "Possibly." "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Sew?" "Yes." "Clean?" "Obviously." He scratched his jaw. "Sadie Miller runs the boarding house 2 blocks up. She's been complaining about needing help since her last girl ran off with a trapper. Can't promise she'll hire you, but she might listen." "Thank you." Clara walked in the direction he'd pointed, past a saloon with its doors propped open, past a building with land office painted on the window, past a group of men unloading lumber from a wagon. One of them whistled. She ignored him. The boarding house was a two-story structure with peeling yellow paint and a crooked sign that read Miller's. Clara climbed the front steps and knocked. A woman opened the door. She was older than Clara by at least 15 years, with gray streaks in her dark hair and the kind of tired eyes that came from raising other people's children. She looked Clara up and down, taking in the good dress, the neat hair, the bag clutched in both hands. "Help you? I'm looking for work," Clara said. "I can cook, clean, sew, and manage accounts. I'm reliable, I don't drink, and I won't steal from you." Sadie Miller leaned against the doorframe. "You're not from here." "Philadelphia. Long way to come for a job." "I came for other reasons. Those reasons didn't work out." Sadie's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "Man?" "A man who turned out not to exist. They usually don't." Sadie stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in. I'll get you some water and we'll talk." The inside of the boarding house smelled like lye soap and old wood. The furniture was plain but clean, the floors swept, the windows open to let in what little breeze existed. Sadie led Clara into a kitchen at the back of the house and poured her a tin cup of water from a pitcher. Clara drank it in 4 long swallows. She hadn't realized how thirsty she was. "So," Sadie said, sitting down across from her, "tell me about this man." Clara set the cup down. "His name was Edgar Holloway. He wrote to me for 8 months, sent me money for a train ticket, told me he owned a ranch outside town and wanted a wife. I believed him." "Edgar Holloway," Sadie repeated slowly. "Tall fellow, blonde hair, smile that makes you feel like you're the only woman in the room?" Clara's stomach dropped. "You know him. Everyone knows Edgar." Sadie's voice had gone flat. "He doesn't own a ranch. He doesn't own anything except the clothes on his back and whatever he can charm out of lonely women. You're not the first girl he's done this to, and you won't be the last." Clara felt her face go hot. "Where is he now?" "Probably halfway to California by now. He moves fast, stays in one place just long enough to set up his next scheme, then disappears before anyone can catch him." "He has my money." "He has everyone's money, honey. That's what men like him do." Clara's hands curled into fists on the table. She wanted to scream. She wanted to cry. She wanted to get back on that train and ride all the way to California just so she could find Edgar Holloway and shove him off a cliff. Instead, she took a breath and said, "Do you need help here or not?" Sadie studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded. "I do, but I can only pay room and board plus $2 a week. It's not much. It's enough. You'll be cleaning rooms, doing laundry, helping with meals. Guests come and go all hours. Some of them are rough types. You'll need a thick skin." "I have one." Sadie stood and held out her hand. "Then you've got yourself a job, Miss Whitlock. Clara Whitlock." They shook. Sadie's grip was strong, her palm calloused. "Welcome to Ridgewater, Clara. Sorry it's under these circumstances." "So am I." Sadie showed her to a small room on the second floor, just big enough for a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk. Clara sat down on the mattress and stared at the bare wall. This was her life now. A rented room in a boarding house in a town that barely existed, working for $2 a week, and wondering how she'd been stupid enough to let a con artist steal everything she had. She didn't cry. She'd cried enough on the train, quietly in her seat while the other passengers pretended not to notice. She was done crying. The next morning, Clara woke at dawn and went downstairs to help Sadie prepare breakfast for the guests. There were 7 of them. 2 traveling salesmen, a surveyor, a widow on her way to visit her daughter, and 3 cowboys who worked for a ranch outside town. They ate quickly and in silence, barely looking at Clara as she poured coffee and set plates in front of them. After breakfast, she stripped beds, scrubbed floors, hauled water, and beat rugs until her arms ached. Sadie worked beside her without complaint, moving through the tasks with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing them for 20 years. They didn't talk much. Clara appreciated that. By the end of the week, Clara had settled into a rhythm. Wake before sunrise, work until dark, collapse into bed too tired to think. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she left Philadelphia, but it was a life. It kept her fed and housed. That was more than some people had. On Saturday afternoon, Clara was sweeping the front porch when a wagon pulled up outside. A man climbed down, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dusty hat and work clothes that had seen better days. He tied the horse to the post and turned toward the house. "Sadie in?" he called. "She's inside," Clara said. He nodded and climbed the steps, boots heavy on the wood. As he passed, Clara caught a glimpse of his face, weathered, unshaven, with pale eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. He didn't smile, didn't even look at her really, just walked past like she wasn't there. A moment later, Sadie came out, drying her hands on her apron. "Coulter, didn't expect to see you today." "Need to pick up supplies," he said. "Thought I'd check if you had any eggs to spare. I've got 2 dozen in the kitchen. Clara, go get them, will you?" Clara set the broom aside and went inside. She found the basket of eggs on the counter, wrapped it in a cloth, and brought it back out. The man, Coulter, was leaning against the porch railing, talking to Sadie in a low voice. Clara caught fragments. "Boy's not eating, stopped talking again, don't know what else to do." Sadie noticed Clara and waved her over. "This is Clara Whitlock. She's been helping me out this week. Clara, this is Coulter Hayes, runs a cattle ranch about 10 miles north of town." Coulter glanced at her, touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am." "Mr. Hayes." She handed him the basket. He took it without a word, pulled a few coins from his pocket, and pressed them into Sadie's hand. "That's too much," Sadie said. "It's fine." He turned and walked back toward the wagon. Clara watched him go, then looked at Sadie. "Is he always like that?" "Like what?" "Grim." Sadie's expression softened. "His wife died 2 years ago. Left him with a boy to raise on his own. He's doing his best, but grief doesn't let go easy." Clara said nothing. She knew about grief. It followed you around like a shadow, showed up at the worst times, made everything harder than it needed to be. She'd lost her parents when she was 19. Her sister had remarried and moved to Boston, and they barely spoke anymore. Grief was part of why she'd answered Edgar's letters in the first place, because being alone hurt more than taking a risk on a stranger. "Does he need help?" Clara asked. Sadie looked at her sharply. "What kind of help?" "A housekeeper. Someone to cook and look after the boy." "Maybe. But Coulter Hayes doesn't ask for help. You'd have to offer, and even then he'd probably say no." Clara nodded. It wasn't her business anyway. But 2 days later, when Coulter's wagon pulled up again, this time with a small boy sitting beside him, Clara was standing on the porch watching. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Dark hair, serious face, clothes too big for him. He didn't say a word as Coulter lifted him down from the wagon, just stood there with his hands shoved in his pockets. "Morning, Sadie," Coulter called. Sadie came outside, wiping flour from her hands. "Morning. Who's this?" "My son, Levi. Figured I'd bring him along today. He's been cooped up too long." Levi didn't look at anyone. He stared at the ground like he was trying to disappear into it. Clara crouched down so she was at his level. "Hello, Levi." He glanced at her, then looked away. "Do you like horses?" she asked. A tiny nod. "I saw a horse this morning with a white spot on its nose. It looked like someone had spilled paint on it. Have you ever seen a horse like that?" Levi's eyes flicked toward her again. This time, he didn't look away quite as fast. "Not recently," he said quietly. It was the first time Clara had heard him speak. His voice was small, careful, like he was testing the weight of every word before he let it out. "Well," Clara said, "if you stick around, maybe we'll see it again." Coulter was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Not quite suspicious, but not grateful either. Just watchful. "Come on, Levi," he said. "We're going to the store." Levi followed him without argument, hands still in his pockets. Clara stood and watched them walk down the street, the man and the boy, both of them carrying silence like armor. Sadie came up beside her. "You're good with children." "I used to teach," Clara said, "before I left Philadelphia." "Why'd you stop?" "The school closed. Money ran out." She paused. "And I thought there was something better waiting for me out here." Sadie didn't say anything to that. She didn't have to. That night, Clara lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. She thought about the boy who wouldn't look at anyone, the father who didn't know how to reach him, the ranch 10 miles north where 2 people were slowly drowning in grief and didn't know how to ask for help. She thought about Edgar Holloway, wherever he was, probably writing letters to some other woman, spinning the same lies. She thought about the $14 she'd had when she stepped off that train, and the $2 a week she was earning now, and how long it would take to save enough to go anywhere else. And she thought about the fact that she didn't actually want to go anywhere else. Philadelphia was gone. The life she'd imagined with Edgar was gone. But this place, this dusty, stubborn, impossible place, was still here. And so was she. 2 weeks passed. Clara worked, saved her wages, and learned the rhythms of the town. She learned that the saloon got loud on Friday nights, that the general store closed early on Sundays, that the sheriff was a man named Boone Mercer, who wore his badge like a shield and his gun like a promise. She also learned that Coulter Hayes came into town every Saturday, always alone, always silent. He bought supplies, picked up his mail, and left without talking to anyone more than necessary. But the third Saturday, he came with Levi again. This time, the boy wandered over to where Clara was hanging laundry in the side yard. He stood a few feet away, watching her pin sheets to the line. "Do you need help?" he asked. Clara glanced at him. "Can you reach the line?" "If I stand on something." She dragged over a crate and handed him a clothespin. "All right, you hold the sheet, I'll pin." They worked in silence for a few minutes. Levi was careful with the fabric, making sure it didn't drag in the dirt. Clara noticed his hands were small but rough, already scarred from ranch work. "Your father seems like a good man," she said. Levi didn't answer right away. Then quietly, "He is." "But?" Levi looked at her, surprised. "I didn't say but." "You thought it, though." He went back to holding the sheet. "He's sad all the time. He thinks I don't notice, but I do." Clara pinned the corner. "Losing someone you love is hard." "I know. I lost her too." His voice was flat, matter of fact. "But she was my mama. She was his wife. I think it's different." "Maybe, or maybe it's just hard in different ways." Levi considered this. Then he said, "Do you have a family?" "Not anymore. I lost my parents a long time ago. My sister lives far away." "So you're alone?" "I am." "Me too," Levi said. Then quickly, I have my pa, but sometimes it feels like being alone anyway." Clara's chest tightened. She knew exactly what he meant. They finished hanging the laundry in silence. When Coulter came looking for Levi, Clara expected him to leave without a word. But instead he stopped at the edge of the yard and said, "Thank you for letting him help." "He's good company," Clara said. Coulter nodded once, then turned to go. Levi followed, but he glanced back at Clara and gave her a small wave. She waved back. That night, Sadie sat down beside Clara at the kitchen table after all the guests had gone to bed. She poured them each a cup of coffee and said, "Coulter Hayes asked about you today." Clara looked up. "What did he ask?" "If you were staying in Ridgewater, if you had family, if you were planning to move on." "What did you tell him?" "That you're staying as long as you want to stay, and that your business is your own." Sadie took a sip of coffee. "But I got the sense he wasn't asking out of curiosity." "Then why was he asking?" "Because he needs help, and he's too stubborn to admit it." Sadie set her cup down. "That boy is disappearing right in front of him, and he doesn't know what to do. He thought bringing him into town would help, but it's not enough. That ranch is too quiet, too full of ghosts." Clara stared into her coffee. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I saw the way you talked to Levi, and I saw the way Coulter watched you do it." Sadie leaned back in her chair. "I'm not saying you should do anything. I'm just saying that if you wanted to offer, he might actually listen." Clara didn't answer. She didn't know what to say. But the next Saturday, when Coulter's wagon pulled up outside the boarding house, Clara was already standing on the porch with her mind made up. She walked down the steps before he could climb out. "Mr. Hayes," she said. He looked at her surprised. "Miss Whitlock, I have a proposal for you." His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Wariness, maybe, or curiosity. "I'm listening." "You need help at your ranch," Clara said. "Someone to cook, clean, manage the house, and keep an eye on your son while you're working. I'm offering to do that." Coulter's jaw tightened. "I don't need—" "Yes, you do." Clara crossed her arms. "I've seen Levi. I've seen you. You're both drowning, and you're too proud to ask anyone for a rope, so I'm throwing you one. I can't pay much. I don't need much. Room, board, and fair wages. I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Hayes. I'm asking for work." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Why?" "Because I need the work, and because your son deserves better than what he's getting right now." It was blunt, maybe too blunt, but Clara was done pretending things were fine when they weren't. Coulter looked away across the street, toward the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "Can you ride a horse?" "I can learn." "Can you handle a rifle?" "If I have to." "Can you cook for 3 people on a wood stove with half the supplies you need?" "I've done worse with less." He turned back to her, and for the first time since she'd met him, something like respect flickered across his face. "All right, you've got the job. We leave Monday morning." Clara nodded. "I'll be ready." Coulter climbed back into the wagon without another word. But as he drove away, Clara saw Levi peek over the side and give her that same small wave. She waved back, heart pounding, wondering what the hell she'd just agreed to. Sadie appeared beside her. "You sure about this?" "No," Clara said, "but I'm doing it anyway. That ranch is 10 miles from town. You'll be alone out there with a man you barely know and a boy who doesn't talk." "I've been alone before," Sadie sighed. "All right. But if it doesn't work out, you come straight back here. No shame in that." Clara nodded, but she already knew she wasn't coming back. Whatever happened at that ranch, whether it broke her or built her into something stronger, she was going to see it through. Because for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, she felt like she had a purpose. Not the life she'd planned, not the future she'd imagined, but something real. And real was enough. Monday morning came with a sky so clear it hurt to look at. Clara stood on the porch of the boarding house with her trunk at her feet and her carpet bag in her hand, watching the road for Coulter's wagon. Sadie had packed her a lunch wrapped in brown paper and told her 3 times that she was welcome back any time, no questions asked. "I'll be fine," Clara said for the 3rd time. "I know you will. Doesn't mean I won't worry." The wagon appeared around the corner, dust trailing behind it like a veil. Coulter pulled up and climbed down without a word. He hoisted Clara's trunk into the back like it weighed nothing, then held out his hand to help her up onto the seat. She took it. His palm was rough, calloused from years of work, and he let go the moment she was settled. Levi sat between them, small and quiet, hands folded in his lap. He glanced at Clara once, then looked straight ahead at the road. "Ready?" Coulter asked. "Ready." He snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward. Clara gripped the edge of the seat to keep from sliding into Levi. The town fell away behind them, swallowed by distance and dust, and soon there was nothing but open land stretching in every direction. Hills rolled off toward the horizon, covered in dry grass that moved like water when the wind hit it. The sky was enormous, pressing down on everything, making Clara feel small in a way she'd never felt in Philadelphia. They rode in silence for the first hour. Clara tried not to stare at Coulter, but it was hard not to notice the way he held the reins loose in his hands, the way his jaw stayed tight, even when there was nothing to be tense about. He looked like a man who'd forgotten how to relax. Levi shifted beside her. "Are you scared?" he asked quietly. "Of what?" "Being so far from town." Clara considered the question. "A little, but I've been scared before. It passes." "What if it doesn't?" "Then I'll be scared and do it anyway." Levi looked at her like he was trying to figure out if she was telling the truth. Then he nodded, satisfied, and went back to watching the road. The ranch appeared just before noon, rising out of the flatland like something planted there by accident. The house was a single-story structure made of rough-cut wood, faded from years of sun and wind. A barn stood behind it, twice the size of the house, with a corral beside it where a few horses stood in the shade. Beyond that, nothing but fences stretching toward the hills and cattle scattered across the grass like dark stones. Coulter pulled the wagon up to the house and climbed down. Clara followed, her boots hitting the dirt with a dull thud. The air smelled like dust and hay and something else she couldn't name. Animal, earth, distance. "This is it," Coulter said. Not proud, not apologetic, just stating a fact. Clara looked at the house. The porch sagged on one side. The windows were streaked with dust. A broken rocking chair leaned against the wall like it had given up trying to stand. "It needs work," she said. "Everything needs work." Coulter grabbed her trunk from the wagon. "Come on, I'll show you inside." The front door stuck when he pushed it, scraping against the floor until he shoved it hard enough to force it open. Clara stepped inside and stopped. The house was dim, the curtains drawn, the air stale. Dust covered everything: the table, the chairs, the mantel above the fireplace. Dishes sat piled in a basin beside the stove. A coat hung on a peg by the door, untouched for so long it looked like it had fused with the wood. "This is the main room," Coulter said. "Kitchen's through there, 2 bedrooms in the back. You'll take the spare one. Levi's got the other next to mine." Clara set her bag down and walked to the window. She pulled the curtain back and light flooded in, exposing every speck of dust, every cobweb, every sign of neglect. The house wasn't just dirty, it was abandoned, not by people leaving, but by people who'd stopped trying. "When did you last clean?" she asked. Coulter didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was flat. "Been a while." "I can see that." Levi appeared in the doorway, watching them both. Clara turned to him. "Do you know where the cleaning supplies are?" He nodded. "Show me." He led her to a narrow closet off the kitchen. Inside, a broom leaned against the wall, its bristles worn down to nubs. A bucket sat on the floor, rusted at the bottom. A bar of lye soap, half used. A rag that might have been white once. Clara picked up the bucket. "This is it?" "Pa says we don't need much." "Your pa is wrong." She carried the bucket outside to the pump and filled it with water, then hauled it back inside. Coulter was still standing in the main room, looking like he didn't know what to do with himself. "You can go," Clara said. "I'll take care of this." "You just got here." "And there's work to do, so either help or get out of the way." For a moment she thought he might argue, but then he picked his hat up off the table and walked out, the door banging shut behind him. Levi stood in the corner watching her. "He doesn't like people telling him what to do." "Then he shouldn't have hired me." Clara dunked the rag in the bucket and started scrubbing the table. "Are you going to stand there or help?" Levi grabbed the broom. They worked for hours. Clara washed every surface she could reach, swept the floors, beat the dust out of the curtains until her arms ached. Levi followed her around, picking up things she pointed to, carrying buckets when they got too heavy for her to lift. He didn't complain, didn't ask questions, just did what needed doing. By the time the sun started to sink, the house looked different. Not perfect, not even close, but cleaner, less like a tomb. Clara found Levi sitting on the front porch, staring out at the land. She sat down beside him, her back against the wall, and let out a long breath. "Your father's not much of a housekeeper," she said. "No, ma'am." "You can call me Clara." Levi glanced at her. "Pa says I should call grown-ups ma'am or sir." "Your pa can call me whatever he wants, but you can call me Clara." Levi thought about this, then nodded. "Okay." They sat in silence for a while. The land stretched out in front of them, golden in the fading light, the hills dark against the sky. Clara had never seen so much space in her life. It should have felt freeing. Instead, it felt like drowning. "Do you miss town?" Levi asked. "A little." "I miss my mama." Clara looked at him. His face was serious, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He said it the way someone might say, "I miss breakfast," or "I miss summer." Simple, factual, like grief was just another part of the day. "I'm sure you do," Clara said quietly. "Pa doesn't talk about her. He says it's better not to." "What do you think?" Levi shrugged. "I think it makes it worse, like pretending she wasn't here." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she just sat with him, the two of them watching the sun go down, until Coulter's voice called from the barn. "Levi, supper." Levi stood and looked down at Clara. "You coming?" "In a minute." He went inside. Clara stayed on the porch, staring at the sky as it turned from gold to pink to purple. Somewhere out there, Edgar Holloway was probably sitting in a saloon, charming another woman, spinning another lie. Somewhere out there, her sister was living a life that didn't include Clara. Somewhere out there, the world kept turning without her. But here, on this porch, in this failing ranch in the middle of nowhere, Clara Whitlock had a job, a place to sleep, a boy who needed someone to see him. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She went inside. The kitchen was small, cramped, with barely enough room for the three of them to sit at the table. Coulter had made beans and cornbread, both of which tasted like they'd been cooked by someone who'd forgotten food was supposed to have flavor. Clara ate without comment. Levi picked at his plate. Coulter didn't look at either of them. Tomorrow I'll take inventory of the pantry, Clara said. Make a list of what we need. Coulter nodded. And I'll need a ride into town at some point to pick up supplies. Saturday. That's 5 days from now. That's when I go. Clara bit back a response. Fine. She'd make do with what they had. After supper, Levi helped her wash the dishes. Coulter disappeared outside, and Clara heard the sound of an axe hitting wood, steady and rhythmic. She dried the last plate and set it on the shelf, then turned to Levi. Do you know how to read? She asked. He shook his head. Do you want to learn? He looked at her like she'd just offered him something impossible. Pa says there's no point. Says I need to learn ranch work, not books. You can learn both. He won't like it. Let me worry about that. Levi hesitated, then nodded. Okay. Clara found a crate in the corner of the main room and dragged it over to the window where the light was best. Inside were a few books, a Bible, a farmer's almanac, a copy of Robinson Crusoe with the cover half torn off. She pulled out the almanac and opened it to the first page. Sit, she said. Levi sat. Clara pointed to the first word. That's January. Can you say it? January. Good. Now this one. They worked until the light faded and Coulter came back inside, smelling like sweat and sawdust. He stopped in the doorway and stared at them. What are you doing? He asked. Teaching, Clara said without looking up. He doesn't need... He does. Clara closed the book and stood. He's 8 years old and he can't read his own name. That's not acceptable. Coulter's jaw tightened. That's not your decision to make. You hired me to take care of this house and look after your son. That's what I'm doing. I hired you to cook and clean. Then you hired the wrong person. They stared at each other. Clara refused to look away. She'd dealt with men like Coulter before. Men who thought they could bully her into silence just by standing there and glaring. It didn't work. It never worked. Finally, Coulter looked at Levi. Go to bed. Levi stood, glanced at Clara, and walked toward his room. The door closed softly behind him. Coulter turned back to Clara. Don't overstep. Don't underestimate your son. You've been here 1 day. You don't know him. I know he's lonely. I know he's grieving. And I know you're so buried in your own grief that you can't see what he needs. Coulter took a step forward, and for a moment Clara thought he might actually throw her out. But then he stopped, his face hard, his hands clenched at his sides. You don't know anything about me, he said quietly. You're right, I don't. But I know what it looks like when someone's drowning, and I know what it looks like when someone's pretending they're not. Coulter stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out of the house, the door slamming shut behind him. Clara stood alone in the dim room, her heart pounding. She'd pushed too hard, she knew it. But she also knew she was right. She picked up the almanac and set it back in the crate, then went to her room and closed the door. The next morning, Clara woke before dawn and dressed quickly in the dark. When she came into the kitchen, Coulter was already gone. A cold pot of coffee sat on the stove, half empty. She poured herself a cup and drank it standing by the window, watching the sun rise over the hills. Levi appeared a few minutes later, rubbing his eyes. Where's Pa? Out working. He always leaves early. Does he come back for lunch? Sometimes. Clara handed Levi a piece of bread left over from the night before. Eat. Then we'll start your lessons. Levi's face brightened. Really? Really? They spent the morning working through the almanac. Levi was slow but determined, sounding out each word with the kind of focus Clara had only seen in children who wanted desperately to prove themselves. By noon, he could read the names of all 12 months without help. Good, Clara said. Tomorrow we'll start on the days of the week. Levi grinned. It was the first real smile Clara had seen from him, and it changed his whole face. Coulter didn't come back for lunch. Clara made beans again, this time with salt pork she found hanging in the cellar, and she and Levi ate in silence. Afterward, she sent him outside to play while she tackled the pantry. It was worse than she'd expected. Half the jars were empty. The flour had weevils. The sugar was hard as a rock. She pulled everything out, sorted it into piles, and started a list of what they needed. By the time she finished, the list was 2 pages long. She found Coulter in the barn that evening, fixing a broken stall door. He didn't look up when she walked in. We need supplies, Claire said, holding up the list. I know. I'm not talking about a few things. I'm talking about everything. Flour, sugar, coffee, salt, lard, beans, cornmeal, eggs if we can get them. The pantry's nearly bare. Coulter set down his hammer and took the list. He read it slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he handed it back. We'll go Saturday. That's not soon enough. It'll have to be. Clara folded her arms. How have you been feeding your son? Same as always. Beans and cornbread, every day. It's enough. It's not. He's too thin. He needs vegetables, meat, milk if you can manage it. Coulter's eyes flashed. I'm doing the best I can. Then let me help you do better. He stared at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Clara saw something other than anger in his face. Exhaustion, maybe. Or resignation. He looked like a man who'd been fighting for so long he'd forgotten what he was fighting for. Fine, he said finally. We'll go Thursday. Thank you. Coulter picked up his hammer and went back to work. Clara stood there for a moment, then turned and walked out of the barn. That night, after Levi had gone to bed, Clara sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and paper, revising her list. She crossed off the things they could live without and underlined the things they couldn't. When she finished, she folded the paper and set it aside, then stared out the window at the dark land beyond. She'd been here 3 days, and already the ranch felt like a different place. Not better, exactly, but less abandoned, less like a place where people had given up. The door opened and Coulter came in, bringing the smell of night air and hay with him. He glanced at Clara, then at the paper on the table. You didn't have to do that, he said. Yes, I did. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove and sat down across from her. They didn't speak. Clara didn't know what to say, and Coulter didn't seem like the kind of man who needed words to fill silence. Finally, he said, Levi told me you're teaching him to read. I am. I meant what I said. He needs to learn ranch work. He's 8. He has time for both. Coulter took a sip of coffee. His mother used to read to him every night before bed. Clara waited. After she died, I tried, Coulter continued, but I'm not good at it. The words don't come out right. And he'd just sit there staring at me, waiting for me to sound like her. I couldn't do it. So you stopped. So I stopped. Clara leaned forward. He doesn't need you to sound like her. He just needs you to try. Coulter looked at her, and for a moment Clara thought she saw something crack in his expression. But then he stood, drained the rest of his coffee, and set the cup in the basin. I'll take you to town Thursday, he said. Be ready by sunrise. He walked out of the room without another word. Thursday morning came cold and gray. Clara dressed in layers and met Coulter at the wagon just as the sun broke over the hills. Levi stood beside him, wrapped in a coat too big for him. He's coming? Clara asked. Figured he could use the trip, Coulter said. They climbed into his wagon and started toward town. The ride was long and quiet, broken only by the sound of the wheels and the occasional snort from the horse. Levi sat between them again, watching the land roll past. When they reached Ridgewater, Coulter pulled the wagon up in front of the general store. Clara climbed down and handed him the list. I'll meet you back here in an hour, he said. Where are you going? To see the sheriff, ranch business. Clara nodded and went inside. The store smelled like coffee and leather and tobacco. The shelves were packed with goods, and Clara moved through them methodically, checking prices, calculating costs, making sure she stayed within the budget Coulter had given her. She was standing at the counter, waiting for the shopkeeper to tally her order when the door opened and a man walked in. He was tall, blond, with a smile that could charm the shoes off a nun. Clara's stomach dropped. Edgar Holloway. He didn't see her at first. He was too busy talking to the shopkeeper, laughing like he'd just told the funniest joke in the world. But then he turned and his eyes landed on Clara and the smile faltered. Just for a second. Then it was back, brighter than before. Clara Whitlock, he said, like they were old friends. I'll be damned. What are you doing here? Clara's hands curled into fists at her sides. I live here. Do you now? Edgar crossed the store toward her, still smiling. Last I heard, you were supposed to be on your way back to Philadelphia. Didn't work out? You would know. The shopkeeper glanced between them, sensing trouble. Edgar ignored him. Now, Clara, he said, his voice smooth as oil, I know you're upset, but there's no need to be dramatic. Dramatic. We had a misunderstanding, that's all. These things happen. Clara took a step toward him. You stole my money. You lied to me for 8 months. You left me stranded in a town where I didn't know anyone. I never promised you anything. You promised me everything. Edgar's smile thinned. You believed what you wanted to believe. That's not my fault. Clara's vision blurred red. She wanted to hit him, wanted to scream at him, wanted to drag him into the street and make sure everyone in Ridgewater knew exactly what kind of man he was. But before she could move, a voice cut through the air. Everything all right here? Clara turned. Coulter stood in the doorway, Levi beside him. His expression was calm, but his eyes were hard as stone. Edgar's smile didn't waver. Everything's fine. Just catching up with an old friend. She doesn't look like your friend. Well, that's between me and her, isn't it? Coulter stepped into the store, his hand resting on Levi's shoulder. Clara, you ready to go? Clara glanced at Edgar one last time. Yes. She picked up the crate of supplies the shopkeeper had packed and walked toward the door. Edgar didn't try to stop her, but as she passed, he leaned in close and whispered, This isn't over. Clara didn't answer. She walked out into the street, Coulter and Levi following behind her. They loaded the supplies into the wagon without speaking. Clara's hands shook as she set the last crate in place, and she hated herself for it. Hated that Edgar could still get under her skin, still make her feel small and stupid and used. Coulter waited until she'd climbed onto the seat before he spoke. Who was that? Nobody. Didn't look like nobody. Clara stared straight ahead at the street. His name is Edgar Holloway. He's the man who brought me to Wyoming. Coulter's jaw tightened. The one who left you at the station. That's him. Levi tugged on Coulter's sleeve. Pa, what's wrong? Nothing, son. Coulter snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward. We're going home. They were halfway out of town when Clara finally spoke again. He said it's not over. Coulter glanced at her. What does that mean? I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe he just wanted the last word. Or maybe he's planning something. Like what? He already took everything I had. Men like that don't stop because they got what they wanted. They stop when someone makes them stop. Clara looked at him. Coulter's face was hard, his eyes fixed on the road, but there was something else there too. Anger, yes, but also something protective. It surprised her. I can handle Edgar Holloway, she said. Maybe, but you won't have to handle him alone. Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than the ride into town. Levi fell asleep against Clara's shoulder, and she shifted carefully so he wouldn't wake. Coulter drove in silence, his hands steady on the reins, his expression unreadable. When they finally pulled up to the house, the sun was already sinking toward the hills. Coulter carried the supplies inside while Clara woke Levi and sent him to wash up for supper. She followed Coulter into the kitchen and started unpacking the crates. Thank you, she said quietly. Coulter set down a sack of flour. For what? For stepping in, back at the store. Didn't do much. You did enough. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded and walked out. Clara stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by bags of cornmeal and jars of preserves, and wondered when exactly Coulter Hayes had started to feel like someone she could count on. That night after supper, Clara sat with Levi at the table and opened the almanac. They were working on the days of the week when Coulter came in from outside and stood in the doorway, watching. Monday, Levi said slowly, pointing at the word. Good. Next one. Tuesday. And the next. Wednesday, Clara said. It's a tricky one. Try again. Wednesday. Perfect. Coulter cleared his throat. Mind if I listen? Clara glanced up, surprised. Not at all. He pulled out a chair and sat down at the far end of the table. Levi looked at him, then at Clara, then went back to the book. They worked for another hour, Levi reading aloud while Clara corrected him gently, and Coulter sat in silence. When they finished, Levi closed the book and yawned. Can we do more tomorrow? He asked. If you want to. I do. Then we will. Levi stood and walked over to Coulter. Did you hear me, Pa? I can read all the days now. I heard. Coulter's voice was rough. You did good. Levi smiled, then headed toward his room. Clara started to stand, but Coulter's voice stopped her. Wait. She sat back down. Coulter stared at the table, his hands folded in front of him. "I was wrong," he said finally, "about the reading. You were right. He needs it. He needs a lot of things." "I know." Coulter looked up at her. "I haven't been a good father to him, not since—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "You're doing the best you can," Clara said. "That's not good enough." "Maybe not, but it's a start." Coulter's expression shifted, something raw and painful flickering across his face. "She died giving birth. The baby, too. I couldn't save either of them. And Levi." His voice broke. "He just looked at me like I was supposed to fix it, like I was supposed to bring them back, and I couldn't." Clara's chest tightened. "That wasn't your fault." "Felt like it was. Grief makes everything feel like your fault." Coulter rubbed his face with both hands. "I don't know how to do this. How to be enough for him. You don't have to be enough. You just have to be there." He looked at her, and Clara saw the weight he'd been carrying for 2 years written in every line of his face. It wasn't just grief. It was guilt. The kind that ate you alive from the inside out. "You're there now," she said quietly. "That's what matters." Coulter nodded slowly, then stood. "Thank you for what you're doing for him. I'm not doing it for you." "I know." He walked to his room and closed the door. Clara sat alone at the table, staring at the almanac, and wondered how 3 broken people had ended up in the same place at the same time. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of work. Clara settled into the rhythm of the ranch, up before dawn, cooking, cleaning, teaching Levi, tending the garden she'd started behind the house. Coulter worked from sunup to sundown, mending fences, branding cattle, fixing everything that had broken over the past 2 years. He didn't talk much, but he stopped disappearing after supper. Instead, he sat at the table while Clara taught Levi, listening without interrupting, his presence quiet but steady. Levi was changing too. He talked more, smiled more, stopped flinching every time someone raised their voice. He followed Clara around like a shadow, asking questions about everything. Why the sky was blue, where the chickens came from, how words got their meanings. Clara answered as best she could, even when she didn't know, because she understood what he was really asking. Am I allowed to be curious? Am I allowed to take up space? The answer was always yes. On a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after Clara's encounter with Edgar, Coulter came into the kitchen and said, "We're going to town." Clara looked up from the bread dough she was kneading. "All of us?" "All of us." Levi's face lit up. "Can I bring my book?" "Bring whatever you want." They rode into Ridgewater under a sky heavy with clouds. The air smelled like rain, and the wind had teeth. Clara pulled her shawl tighter and watched the horizon, half expecting to see Edgar Holloway standing in the middle of the road like a ghost she couldn't shake. But when they reached town, the street was quiet. Coulter pulled the wagon up in front of the general store and helped Clara down. Levi jumped off the back and ran ahead, clutching his almanac. "Stay where I can see you," Coulter called. "Yes, sir." Clara followed Coulter into the store. The shopkeeper greeted them with a nod, then went back to stocking shelves. Clara was halfway through her list when the door opened and a woman walked in. She was older than Clara by a few years, dressed in a plain brown dress with her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She glanced at Clara, then at Coulter, and her expression hardened. "Coulter Hayes," she said. Coulter turned. "Mrs. Brennan? I heard you hired yourself a housekeeper." "That's right." Mrs. Brennan's gaze slid to Clara. "And here she is." Clara set down the jar she'd been holding. "Can I help you with something?" "Just making an observation." "Then observe somewhere else." Mrs. Brennan's mouth tightened. "I don't know who you think you are, but this is a small town. People talk." "Let them." "You don't care what they say?" "Not particularly." Mrs. Brennan looked at Coulter. "You sure about this? Bringing a strange woman into your house? Letting her take care of your boy?" "She's not strange," Coulter said flatly, "and it's none of your business." "It's everyone's business when a widower starts keeping company with—" "Careful," Coulter said, his voice dropping. "Finish that sentence and we're done here." Mrs. Brennan's face flushed. She glanced between them, then turned and walked out without another word. The shopkeeper let out a low whistle. "That woman's got a mouth on her." "Ignore her," Coulter said. "She's been looking for something to gossip about since her husband ran off." Clara picked up the jar again, but her hands were shaking. Is that what people think? That I'm... Doesn't matter what they think. It does if it affects Levi. Coulter stepped closer, his voice low. Levi's happier than he's been in 2 years. That's all that matters. The rest of them can go to hell. Clara looked up at him, startled by the intensity in his voice. Coulter held her gaze for a moment, then turned and walked toward the counter. They finished their shopping in silence and loaded everything into the wagon. Levi climbed into the back, and Clara was about to follow when a voice called her name. "Miss Whitlock?" She turned. Sheriff Boone Mercer stood a few feet away, his hat in his hands. "Sheriff, got a minute?" Clara glanced at Coulter, who nodded. She followed the sheriff a short distance down the street, out of earshot. "What's this about?" she asked. "Edgar Holloway." Clara's stomach dropped. "What about him?" "He's been asking questions. About you, where you're staying, who you're working for, whether you've got any money saved up." "Why?" "That's what I'd like to know." The sheriff's expression was serious. "I did some digging. Turns out Edgar's got a reputation. He's run this same scheme in 4 different towns across 3 states. Writes to lonely women, convinces them to come west, takes their money, disappears. I know what he is." "Then you know he doesn't just walk away. He comes back when he thinks there's more to take." Clara's mouth went dry. "I don't have anything left." "Maybe, but he doesn't know that. And if he thinks you do, he'll come looking." "What am I supposed to do?" "Stay away from him. Don't go anywhere alone. And if he approaches you, you come find me immediately." The sheriff put his hat back on. "I can't arrest him without proof, but I can make sure he knows I'm watching." Clara nodded. "Thank you." She walked back to the wagon, her mind racing. Coulter was watching her, his expression unreadable. "What did he say?" Coulter asked. "Edgar's been asking about me." Coulter's jaw tightened. "Get in the wagon." They rode back to the ranch in silence. The sky had darkened, and the first drops of rain were starting to fall by the time they pulled up to the house. Coulter unhitched the horse while Clara and Levi carried the supplies inside. The rain came harder, drumming on the roof, turning the dirt road to mud. That night, after Levi had gone to bed, Clara sat at the kitchen table and stared out the window at the storm. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the hills for a split second before plunging them back into darkness. Coulter came in from checking the barn, soaked through. He peeled off his coat and hung it by the door, then poured himself a cup of coffee. "You're worried," he said. "Yes." "About Edgar?" "Yes." Coulter sat down across from her. "He's not going to touch you." "You don't know that." "I know I won't let him." Clara looked at him. Rain dripped from his hair, ran down his face, but he didn't move to wipe it away. He just sat there, solid and sure, like a wall she could lean against. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care?" Coulter was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "Because you showed up here, and you didn't run. Because you look at my son like he matters. Because you—" He stopped, shook his head. "Because you're part of this place now. And I protect what's mine." Clara's breath caught. "I'm not yours." "Didn't say you were. Said you're part of this place. There's a difference." "Is there?" Coulter didn't answer. He just looked at her, and Clara saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Something raw and honest and terrifying. She stood quickly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I should get some sleep." "Clara, Good night, Coulter." She walked to her room and closed the door, her heart pounding. She leaned against the wall and pressed her hands to her face, trying to steady her breathing. She wasn't falling for him. She couldn't be. That would be stupid, reckless, the kind of thing that got you hurt. But when she closed her eyes, all she could see was the way he'd looked at her across the table. Like she was something worth protecting, like she mattered, and that scared her more than Edgar Holloway ever could. The next morning, the storm had passed. Clara woke to clear skies and the smell of coffee already brewing. When she came into the kitchen, Coulter was sitting at the table with Levi, showing him how to tie a proper knot. "Morning?" Clara said. "Morning." Coulter didn't look at her. "There's coffee." She poured herself a cup and sat down. Levi glanced between them, sensing the tension but not understanding it. "Can Clara come with us today?" he asked. Coulter frowned. "Come where?" "To check the fence line. You said I could help." "That's ranch work, Levi. Clara's got enough to do here. I don't mind, Clara said. I could use the air. Coulter looked at her, surprised. You sure? I'm sure. An hour later, they were riding across the open land on horseback. Coulter had saddled a gentle mare for Clara, and though she'd never ridden before, she caught on quickly. Levi rode beside his father on a pony, chattering about everything and nothing, his voice carried away by the wind. They stopped at a broken section of fence, and Coulter climbed down to inspect it. Clara dismounted and walked over to where Levi was crouched in the grass, watching a beetle crawl across a rock. Look, he said, pointing. It's carrying something. Clara knelt beside him. The beetle was dragging a piece of grass twice its size. He's working hard. Why doesn't he just leave it? Maybe he needs it. Or maybe he's just stubborn. Levi laughed. Like Pa. Like your pa, Clara agreed. Coulter called over to them. Levi, come hold this board. Levi ran over and Clara watched as Coulter showed him how to brace the wood while he hammered. The boy was small, but he didn't complain, didn't give up. He just held on until the job was done. They worked their way along the fence line for hours. By the time they stopped for lunch, Clara's back ached and her hands were raw, but she didn't care. The land stretched out around them, golden and endless. And for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, Clara felt like she could breathe. They ate under the shade of a lone tree, bread and cheese and water from a canteen. Levi lay back in the grass, staring up at the sky. You think there's anything up there? He asked. Like what? Clara said. I don't know, something bigger than us. Clara glanced at Coulter, who was watching his son with an expression she couldn't name. Maybe, she said, but I think what's down here matters more. Levi thought about this, then nodded. Yeah, me too. They rode back to the ranch as the sun started to set. Clara was exhausted, covered in dust and sweat, but she felt something else too. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt like she belonged. That night, after supper, Clara was washing dishes when Coulter came up beside her and picked up a towel. You don't have to do that, she said. I know. They worked in silence for a few minutes. Then Coulter said, You did good today. Thanks. Levi likes having you around. I like being around. Coulter set down the towel and turned to face her. Clara. The door burst open. Levi stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide. Pa, he said, his voice shaking. There's someone outside. Coulter was across the room in 2 strides. He grabbed his rifle from the rack by the door and looked out the window. Clara followed, her heart pounding. A figure stood in the yard, silhouetted against the moonlight. Tall, broad-shouldered, hands in his pockets. Edgar Holloway. Coulter opened the door and stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. Get off my property. Edgar raised his hand, smiling. Easy, friend. I'm just here to talk. We've got nothing to talk about. I think we do. Edgar's gaze shifted to Clara, who stood behind Coulter in the doorway. Hello, Clara. Leave, Clara said. Now. I will. But first, I need to clear something up. Edgar took a step forward, and Coulter raised the rifle. Edgar stopped, still smiling. You told people I'm a con man, that I stole from you. Because you did. That's your word against mine. And in this town, my word carries weight. Not with the sheriff, Coulter said. The sheriff can't do anything without proof, and you don't have any, do you? Clara's hands clenched into fists. Everyone knows what you are. Do they? Or do they just know what you told them? Edgar's smile widened. See, here's the thing. I've been in Ridgewater for a month now. I've made friends. I've invested in property. I'm a respectable businessman. And you're just some woman who showed up out of nowhere, making accusations. Get to the point, Coulter said. The point is, Clara needs to stop spreading lies about me, or I'll make sure this whole town knows she's the liar. Try it, Coulter said, his voice deadly calm, and see what happens. Edgar looked at him, the smile finally fading. You really want to go to war over her? I'm not going to war over anything. I'm protecting what's mine. Now get off my land before I shoot you for trespassing. For a long moment, Edgar just stood there. Then he tipped his hat, turned, and walked into the darkness. Coulter didn't lower the rifle until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Clara was shaking. Levi stood behind her, clutching her skirt. Coulter set the rifle down and closed the door, locking it. He's going to come back, Clara said. I know. What are we going to do? Coulter looked at her, his face hard. We're going to finish this. The morning after Edgar's visit, Clara woke to the smell of smoke. Not the clean smell of a cooking fire, but something sharper, meaner. She threw off her blanket and ran to the window. The eastern sky glowed orange and ash drifted past the glass like snow. She dressed in seconds and burst into the kitchen. Coulter was already there, pulling on his boots, his face grim. What is it? Clara asked. Wildfire. Started sometime in the night. Wind's pushing it this direction. How far? Far enough that we've got time. Not enough that we can waste it. Levi stumbled out of his room, rubbing his eyes. Pa? Get dressed, Coulter said. Fast as you can. Clara's mind raced. What do we do? We clear a fire break around the house and barn, cut down anything that'll burn, wet down the roof if we can. Coulter grabbed his hat. And we pray the wind shifts. They worked like the world was ending, because it might as well have been. Clara hauled water from the pump while Coulter and Levi hacked at the dry grass surrounding the house with shovels and axes. The smoke thickened as the morning wore on, turning the sun into a dull red disk. Clara's eyes burned. Her throat felt raw. By noon, they'd cleared a rough circle of bare earth around the buildings. Coulter climbed onto the roof with a bucket and soaked the shingles. Clara stood in the yard watching the horizon. The fire was visible now, a line of flame crawling across the hills like something alive. How long do we have? She called up to Coulter. Hard to say. Could be hours. Could be less. What if it reaches us? Then we run. Clara's stomach twisted. Where? The creek bed 2 miles west. Water's low this time of year, but it's better than nothing. Levi appeared beside Clara, his face streaked with soot. Are we going to die? No, Clara said firmly. We're not. How do you know? Because I said so. It wasn't much of an answer, but it was all she had. Levi nodded and went back to work. The afternoon dragged on. The wind picked up, hot and fierce, carrying embers that landed in the dirt and smoldered. Clara stomped them out, over and over, until her legs ached. Coulter came down from the roof and sent Levi inside to pack a bag with food and water. Just in case, he said when Clara looked at him. You think it'll come to that? I think we prepare for the worst and hope for the best. Clara wiped sweat from her face. I'm not leaving without you. You'll leave if I tell you to. The hell I will. Coulter's eyes flashed, but he didn't argue. He just handed her a shovel and said, Then keep working. By late afternoon, the fire was close enough that Clara could hear it. A low roar like wind through trees, except there were no trees anymore. Just flame and smoke and heat that made the air shimmer. The animals in the corral were spooked, stamping and snorting. Coulter opened the gate and drove them out toward open land. Why'd you do that? Levi asked. Give them a chance to run, Coulter said. Better than burning alive. The sun disappeared behind the smoke. The world turned the color of rust. Clara stood on the porch, watching the fire creep closer, and thought about all the things she hadn't said, to Coulter, to Levi, to herself. She thought about Edgar Holloway and how none of this would have happened if she'd stayed in Philadelphia. But then she wouldn't have met Levi, wouldn't have found this place, wouldn't have discovered that she was stronger than she'd ever believed. Clara? She turned. Coulter stood behind her, his face blackened with soot, his eyes bloodshot from smoke. If this goes bad, he said quietly, you take Levi and you run for the creek. Don't wait for me. I'm not having this argument again. I'm not asking. His voice was rough. If something happens to me, he needs you. You understand? Clara's throat tightened. Nothing's going to happen to you. You don't know that. Yes, I do. Because you're too stubborn to die. Coulter's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Yeah, maybe. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His hand lingered for a moment, rough and warm against her cheek. Then he turned and walked back into the smoke. Clara stood frozen on the porch, her heart hammering. She wanted to call him back, wanted to tell him that she was terrified, that she didn't know how to lose someone else, that somewhere in the past few weeks he'd stopped being just her employer and started being something she couldn't name. But the words stuck in her throat, and Coulter was already gone. The fire hit the fire break just before dusk. Clara watched it creep up to the edge of the bare earth they'd cleared and stop, frustrated, searching for fuel. For a moment, she thought they'd won. Then an ember landed on the barn roof. Coulter saw it at the same time she did. He grabbed a ladder and climbed up, bucket in hand, but the wind gusted and the ember flared. Fire spread across the shingles faster than he could move. "Get down!" Clara screamed. Coulter jumped, landing hard in the dirt. The barn was burning now, flames licking up the sides, smoke pouring from the loft. Clara ran toward it, but Coulter caught her arm. "It's gone," he said. "Let it go." The house? The house is fine. We cleared enough space. The barn was always a risk. They stood together and watched it burn. Levi came out of the house and pressed himself against Coulter's side. Coulter put his arm around his son and held him close. "Is everything going to burn?" Levi asked, his voice small. "No," Coulter said, "just the barn." "What about the animals?" "They ran. They're smart. They'll survive." Levi buried his face in Coulter's shirt. Clara looked away, giving them privacy, but Coulter reached out and pulled her close too. The three of them stood there in the smoke and ash, watching the barn collapse in on itself, and Clara realized this was what family felt like. Not perfect, not easy, just people holding each other up when everything else was falling apart. The fire burned itself out overnight. By morning, the land around the ranch was blackened and smoldering, but the house still stood. The barn was gone, reduced to a skeleton of charred beams and ash. The corral fence had burned. The garden was destroyed. But they were alive. Clara walked through the ruins, her boots crunching on scorched earth. Coulter and Levi were checking the water pump to make sure it still worked. The sky was gray with lingering smoke, and the air tasted like char. She found Levi sitting on the porch steps, staring at the wreckage of the barn. She sat down beside him. "You okay?" she asked. "I guess. It's all right if you're not." Levi picked at a splinter in the step. "I thought we were going to die." "So did I. But we didn't." "No, we didn't." Levi looked at her. "Because of you and Pa. Because of all of us." "Do you think the animals made it?" "I do. Your Pa was right. They're smart." Levi nodded slowly. Then he said, "Clara?" "Yeah? I'm glad you're here." Clara's throat closed up. She put her arm around him and pulled him close. "Me too, kid. Me too." Coulter came around the corner, saw them sitting together, and stopped. For a moment, he just stood there, watching. Then he walked over and sat down on Levi's other side. "Pump's working," he said. "That's good," Clara said. "We'll need to rebuild the barn, order lumber, hire help if we can afford it. We'll figure it out." Coulter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I couldn't have done this without you." Clara looked at him. His face was haggard, his eyes red-rimmed, but there was something else there too, something raw and honest. "You would have found a way," she said. "Maybe, but I'm glad I didn't have to." They sat together on the porch, the three of them, and watched the sun break through the smoke. The land was ruined, the barn was gone, and everything they'd worked for was covered in ash. But they were still here. 2 days later, Coulter hitched up the wagon and said they were going to town. Clara started to protest. There was too much work to do, too much to clean up, but Coulter cut her off. "We need supplies," he said. "And I need to talk to the sheriff." "About what?" "About Edgar Holloway." Clara's stomach dropped. She'd almost forgotten about Edgar in the chaos of the fire. Almost, but not quite. He was still out there, still circling like a vulture, waiting for something to die. They rode into Ridgewater under a pale sky. The town looked the same as always, untouched by the fire that had nearly destroyed the ranch. People went about their business, talking and laughing, and Clara felt a surge of resentment. They had no idea what the past 2 days had been like. No idea what it cost to survive. Coulter pulled up in front of the sheriff's office and climbed down. "Wait here," he said. "I'm coming with you." "Clara, he came to my ranch too. I'm coming." Coulter looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. He just nodded and held the door open. Sheriff Mercer was sitting at his desk, cleaning his rifle. He looked up when they walked in. "Coulter, Miss Whitlock. Heard about the fire. Glad you made it through." "Barely," Coulter said. "We need to talk about Edgar Holloway." The sheriff set down the rifle. "What about him?" He showed up at my ranch 3 nights ago, threatened Clara, told her to stop spreading lies about him or he'd ruin her reputation. Did he hurt anyone? No, but he's not done. You know he's not. The sheriff leaned back in his chair. I know, but without proof, there's not much I can do. Threatening someone isn't a crime unless you can prove intent. Intent? Clara's voice rose. He came to the ranch in the middle of the night and left without laying a hand on anyone, the sheriff interrupted. I'm not saying he's not dangerous. I'm saying the law ties my hands. Coulter's jaw tightened. So we're supposed to just wait until he does something worse? No, you're supposed to stay vigilant and let me do my job. The sheriff stood. I've been asking around. Edgar's made some enemies in town. People are starting to figure out he's not who he says he is. Give it time. We don't have time, Clara said. Then make time. The sheriff's voice was firm. Look, I know you're scared, but if I arrest him without cause, he walks and you lose your only shot at getting rid of him. Trust me on this. Coulter didn't look convinced, but he nodded. Fine, but if he shows up at my ranch again, then you defend yourself, and you let me know immediately. They left the sheriff's office and walked toward the general store. Clara's hands were shaking. She shoved them in her pockets so Coulter wouldn't see. He's right, you know, Coulter said. About what? About waiting. Edgar's smart. He'll slip up eventually. And what if he doesn't? Then we make him. Clara stopped walking. What does that mean? Coulter turned to face her. It means we stop playing defense. We figure out what he wants and we use it against him. That's a terrible plan. You got a better one? Clara didn't. She just stood there staring at Coulter, trying to figure out if he was brave or crazy or both. They finished their shopping in silence and loaded the wagon. Levi had wandered over to the livery stable to look at the horses, and Clara was about to call him back when a voice cut through the air. Well, well, if it isn't the happy little family. Edgar Holloway stood in the middle of the street, smiling like he'd just won a prize. He looked the same as always, tall, handsome, infuriatingly confident. Clara's hands curled into fists. Walk away, Coulter said quietly. Why would I do that? Edgar spread his arms. It's a free country. I can stand wherever I want. Not if you're harassing people. Harassing? Edgar laughed. I'm just saying hello. You're blocking the street. Am I? Edgar took a step to the side, still smiling. Better? Coulter moved toward him, and Clara grabbed his arm. Don't. Listen to her, Coulter, Edgar said. She's got a good head on her shoulders. Knows when to cut her losses. What's that supposed to mean? Clara demanded. Edgar's gaze shifted to her. It means you're wasting your time out here, playing house with a man who's still in love with a dead woman, raising a kid who's not yours. For what? $2 a week and a roof over your head? Shut your mouth, Coulter said, his voice deadly. Why? Because I'm telling the truth? Edgar took a step closer. You think she's here because she cares about you? She's here because she's got nowhere else to go. I made sure of that. Clara stepped forward, her voice shaking with rage. You didn't make sure of anything. You're a liar and a thief and a coward, and everyone in this town is starting to figure that out. Edgar's smile faded. Careful, Clara. Or what? You'll threaten me again? You'll spread more lies? Clara's voice rose. Go ahead. Do your worst. Because I'm done being afraid of you. A crowd had gathered now. People stopped on the sidewalk, watching. The shopkeeper stepped out of his store. A woman with a baby on her hip stared from across the street. Edgar glanced around, his confidence faltering for the first time. You're making a scene. Good, Clara said. Let everyone see what you really are. She turned to the crowd. This man is Edgar Holloway. He writes letters to women back east, promises them a better life, takes their money, and abandons them. He did it to me. He's done it to others, and he'll keep doing it as long as people like you let him. That's a lie, Edgar said, but his voice had lost its smoothness. Is it? Clara pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket, one of Edgar's letters, the one where he'd promised to marry her. She held it up. This is his handwriting, his signature. He sent me money for a train ticket and told me he'd be waiting at the station, but he wasn't, because he never intended to be. The crowd murmured. A man in a suit stepped forward. I've heard stories about him, from a woman in Cheyenne. And I heard something from a friend in Denver, a woman added. Edgar's face went red. This is ridiculous. You're all criminals? Sheriff Mercer appeared at the edge of the crowd, his hand resting on his gun. Funny you should mention that. I just got a wire from the marshal's office in Laramie. Seems there's a warrant out for your arrest. Fraud, theft, conspiracy. Edgar took a step back. That's not... Save it. The sheriff grabbed Edgar's arm and twisted it behind his back. You're under arrest. Edgar struggled, but the sheriff was stronger. He dragged Edgar toward the jail, and the crowd parted to let them through. Clara stood in the middle of the street, her heart pounding, barely able to believe what had just happened. Coulter was beside her. You all right? I think so. That was brave. That was stupid. Same thing sometimes. Clara laughed, a shaky, breathless sound. Levi ran over and threw his arms around her waist. You yelled at him, he said, his voice full of awe. I did. He deserved it. Yeah, he did. Coulter put his hand on Clara's shoulder and she leaned into him without thinking. They stood there together, the three of them, while the crowd slowly dispersed and the town went back to normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. Something had shifted. Something had broken open. And Clara wasn't sure if it was her or the world or both. That night, back in the ranch, Clara sat on the porch and stared at the ruins of the barn. The fire had taken so much. The drought had taken more. And Edgar had tried to take everything. But he'd failed. The door opened behind her, and Coulter stepped out. He sat down beside her without a word. Thank you, Clara said quietly. For what? For standing with me, in town. You didn't need me. You handled it yourself. Maybe. But it was easier knowing you were there. Coulter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I meant what I said during the fire, about Levi needing you. I know. But it's not just him. Coulter's voice was rough. I need you too. Clara's breath caught. She turned to look at him, and the expression on his face made her chest ache. Coulter, I know this isn't what you signed up for, he said quickly. I know you came here because you had nowhere else to go. But you stayed. You fought for this place, for him, for... He stopped, shook his head. I don't know how to say this without sounding like a fool. Then be a fool. Coulter looked at her, his eyes searching hers. I'm falling for you, Clara. Hell, I've already fallen. And I know that's not fair, and I know you might not feel the same way, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel it. Clara stared at him, her mind racing. She thought about all the reasons this was a bad idea. She thought about Edgar, about grief, about how broken they both were. She thought about leaving, about running, about protecting herself the way she always had. And then she thought about Levi's laugh, about the way Coulter looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, about the feeling of standing on the porch during the fire, holding both of them close and realizing she'd never felt more at home in her life. I feel it too, she said quietly. Coulter went very still. You do? Yes. Since when? I don't know. Maybe since that first day when Levi waved at me from the wagon? Maybe longer. Clara's voice shook. I'm scared, Coulter. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be part of something without losing myself. Then we'll figure it out together. What if we can't? Then we'll fail together, Clara laughed, a broken sound that was half sob. That's not very reassuring. It's the best I've got. Coulter reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough, scarred from years of work, but his grip was steady. Clara looked down at their joined hands and felt something inside her crack open. Okay, she said. Okay. Okay. Coulter pulled her close, and Clara let herself fall into him. His arms came around her, solid and warm, and for the first time in months, maybe years, she let herself believe that this might actually work. They sat together on the porch until the stars came out, and the ruins of the barn faded into shadow, and the land stretched out around them like a promise they were both too stubborn to break. The morning after their conversation on the porch, Clara woke to find Coulter already gone. She dressed quickly and went outside, expecting to find him working, but the yard was empty. The wagon was missing too. Levi was in the kitchen, eating bread and jam. Pa left early, he said when Clara walked in. Said he had business in town. Clara's stomach tightened. Did he say what kind of business? No, ma'am. She poured herself coffee and tried not to worry. But worry settled in her chest anyway, heavy and cold. Edgar was in jail. The sheriff had arrested him. But men like Edgar had a way of slipping through cracks that should have held them. Coulter came back just after noon, the wagon loaded with lumber. He climbed down, his face unreadable. "What's all this?" Clara asked. "Material for the barn." "We can't afford—" "Already paid for." Coulter started unloading boards. "Sheriff said Edgar had a bank account in town. Turns out it was full of money he stole from women across 3 states. Judge seized it this morning, ordered restitution for everyone he'd cheated." Clara stared at him. "Including me?" "Including you." "How much?" "Enough to rebuild the barn and then some." Coulter set down a board and looked at her. "He's going to prison, Clara. Real prison. 20 years minimum." Clara's knees went weak. She sat down hard on the porch step. 20 years. Judge said he's been running this scheme for over a decade. You weren't the first. You weren't even the 10th. Coulter sat down beside her. "But you were the one who stood up and said something. That's what broke it open." Clara didn't know what to feel. Relief, yes, but also something darker. Anger at how long it had taken. Grief for all the women who'd believed Edgar's lies before her. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we build." Coulter stood and held out his hand. "Come on, we've got work to do." They spent the next 3 weeks rebuilding. Coulter hired 2 men from town to help with the heavy lifting, and Clara worked alongside them, hammering nails, hauling boards, sweating through her clothes by mid-morning every day. Levi helped where he could, holding tools, fetching water, staying out of the way when the adults told him to. The barn rose slowly, 1 beam at a time. It wasn't as big as the old one, but it was solid, strong. Clara stood in the doorway one evening and looked at what they'd built, and something inside her settled. This was real. This was hers. Not because someone had given it to her, but because she'd earned it. Coulter came up beside her, wiping sweat from his forehead. "What do you think?" "I think it's perfect." "It's crooked on the north side." "It's still perfect." Coulter smiled, and Clara realized it was the first real smile she'd seen from him since they'd met. It changed his whole face, made him look younger, less haunted. "You're easy to please," he said. "I'm not. I just know what matters." That night, after Levi had gone to bed, Clara and Coulter sat on the porch with mugs of coffee. The air was cooler now, autumn creeping in, and Clara pulled a shawl around her shoulders. "I've been thinking," Coulter said. "About what?" "About us." Clara's heart skipped. "What about us?" Coulter stared out at the dark land. "You could leave. Now that Edgar's gone, now that you've got money, you could go anywhere, start over." "Is that what you want?" "No." His voice was rough. "But I need to know if it's what you want." Clara set down her mug. "Why would I leave?" "Because you came here out of desperation, not choice. And now you've got a choice." "I've always had a choice, Coulter. I chose to stay." "For how long?" "For as long as you'll have me." Coulter turned to look at her, and the expression on his face made Clara's breath catch. "I want you to stay forever." "Forever's a long time." "I know." "You might get tired of me." "I won't." "You don't know that." Coulter reached out and took her hand. "Clara Whitlock, I've known you for 3 months. In that time, you've survived a con man, a wildfire, and the worst my grief could throw at you. You've taught my son to read, fixed my house, and made me remember what it feels like to be something other than empty." His voice cracked. "If I'm going to get tired of you, it would have happened by now." Clara's eyes burned. "That's not very romantic." "I'm not a romantic man." "No, you're not." Clara squeezed his hand. "But you're a good man, and that's better." Coulter leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't smooth or practiced or anything like the kisses Clara had imagined when she was younger. It was awkward and hesitant and tasted like coffee. But it was real. And real was all Clara had ever wanted. When they pulled apart, Coulter rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me." Clara froze. "What?" "Marry me. Not because you have to. Not because you're stuck here. But because you want to." "Coulter, I know it's fast. I know we're both a mess. But I also know I don't want to wake up one morning and find out you've left because I never asked you to stay." His hands framed her face. So I'm asking, will you marry me? Clara's throat closed. She thought about the girl who'd stepped off that train months ago, full of hope and fear and desperate belief that someone out there would want her. That girl was gone. In her place was someone harder, stronger, more real, and this man, this stubborn, broken, impossible man, wanted her anyway. Yes, Clara said. I'll marry you? Coulter kissed her again, and this time it was less awkward. This time, Clara kissed him back. They were married 2 weeks later in the front yard of the ranch. Sheriff Mercer officiated, Sadie stood as witness, and Levi held the ring, a simple gold band Coulter had bought in town. Clara wore her gray dress, the same one she'd arrived in, because it felt right to come full circle. The ceremony lasted 5 minutes. Coulter's vows were short and gruff. Clara's were shorter. When the sheriff pronounced them married, Levi whooped and Sadie dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Afterward, they had cake that Sadie had baked and coffee that Clara made too strong. The sun set over the hills, painting everything gold, and Clara stood beside her husband, and thought about how nothing had gone the way she'd planned, and how that was exactly as it should be. That night, after Sadie had gone back to town and Levi had fallen asleep on the couch, Clara and Coulter sat together in the quiet house. Coulter had built a fire in the hearth, and the light flickered across the walls. You know what the funny thing is? Clara said. What? I came here looking for a husband, and I found one, just not the one I was expecting. Coulter smiled. You think Edgar would have made you happy? No, but I didn't know that then. What do you know now? Clara thought about it. I know that happiness isn't something someone gives you. It's something you build, with your own hands, out of dirt and sweat and stubbornness. That's a hell of a way to describe marriage. It's the truth, though. Coulter pulled her close. Yeah, it is. They sat together until the fire burned down to embers, and Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was real. The winter came hard and fast. Snow buried the ranch in November and didn't let up until March. Clara spent the cold months teaching Levi everything she could: reading, writing, arithmetic, history. He soaked it up like drought-dry earth soaking up rain. By spring, he was reading chapter books on his own. Coulter worked through the winter, tending the cattle, repairing equipment, keeping the ranch alive. Clara worked beside him when she could, and when she couldn't, she kept the house running. They fell into a rhythm that wasn't always smooth, but was always steady. There were hard days. Days when Coulter's grief came roaring back and he disappeared into himself, unreachable. Days when Clara wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. Days when Levi cried for his mother and nothing Clara said could comfort him. But there were good days, too. Days when Levi laughed so hard he couldn't breathe. Days when Coulter kissed Clara in the kitchen while the coffee boiled over. Days when the three of them sat on the porch and watched the sunset and didn't need to say a word. By the time spring arrived, the ranch was starting to look like something that would last. The barn was finished, the garden was planted. The cattle had survived the winter. They weren't rich. They weren't even comfortable. But they were alive. And they were together. One warm afternoon in May, Clara found an old sewing basket in the closet. It was covered in dust, untouched for years. She opened it carefully and found fabric scraps, thread, needles, and a half-finished quilt. She carried it into the kitchen and set it on the table. Coulter came in from outside and stopped when he saw it. That was hers, he said quietly. I know. She was making it for Levi, never finished. Clara ran her fingers over the stitching. It was careful work, patient work, the kind of thing that took time and love. Do you mind if I finish it? Coulter was silent for a long moment. Then he shook his head. No, I think she'd like that. Clara spent the next 2 weeks working on the quilt. She sat on the porch in the evening, stitching by lamplight while Levi did his schoolwork, and Coulter fixed broken tools. When she finally tied off the last thread, she held it up. It wasn't perfect. Her stitches were uneven in places, and the pattern didn't quite match, but it was whole. She folded it and set it on Levi's bed. When he found it that night, he ran his hands over the fabric with something like wonder. Mama made this, he said. She started it, Claire said. I finished it. Levi looked up at her. Thank you. Clara hugged him, and he hugged her back, and when she left the room, she found Coulter standing in the hallway. His eyes were red. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Yes, I did." "Why?" "Because she was part of this family, and she always will be." Clara took his hand. "I'm not trying to replace her, Coulter. I'm just trying to honor her." Coulter pulled her close and held her tight, and Clara knew she'd done the right thing. Summer came, and with it the heat and dust Clara had learned to expect. But this year there was rain too. Not a lot, but enough. The grass turned green, the garden flourished, the cattle grew fat. One evening, Clara stood in the garden with a basket of vegetables on her hip and looked out at the land. It wasn't beautiful, exactly. It was harsh and unforgiving and demanded everything from the people who tried to live on it. But it was hers and Coulter's and Levi's. They'd earned it with blood and sweat and sheer refusal to quit. Levi ran past her, chasing a chicken that had escaped the coop. He was taller now, stronger, his face less haunted. He laughed more, talked more, took up space in the world the way a child should. Coulter came up beside Clara and slipped his arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "How none of this went the way I planned." "Regret it?" "Not even a little." Coulter kissed the top of her head. "Good, because you're stuck with us now." "I can think of worse places to be stuck." They stood together and watched Levi finally catch the chicken. He held it up triumphantly, and Clara laughed. The sound carried across the yard bright and clear, and Clara realized this was what home felt like. Not a place, not a building, but people who saw you and loved you anyway. That night, Clara sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the stars come out. Coulter was inside, reading to Levi from a book about explorers. Clara could hear his voice through the open window, slow and careful, trying to make the words sound the way they were supposed to. She thought about the woman she'd been when she arrived in Ridgewater. Lost. Betrayed. Desperate for someone to save her. That woman didn't exist anymore. In her place was someone who'd learned that you couldn't wait for salvation. You had to build it yourself, one day at a time, out of whatever materials you had. The door opened and Coulter stepped out. He sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "He fell asleep halfway through chapter 3, Coulter said. "He does that." "I don't mind. Gives me an excuse to stop." Clara smiled. "You're getting better at it." "Liar." "A little better." Coulter took her hand. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds, crickets, wind, the distant call of an owl. "You know what I've been thinking?" Coulter said finally. "What?" "That we should expand. Buy more cattle, maybe hire some hands. Build this place into something that lasts." Clara looked at him. "You think we can?" "I think we've already started." "It'll be hard. Everything worth doing is hard." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. "Then let's do it." "Yeah?" "Yeah." They sat together until the stars filled the sky, making plans for a future that felt solid and real. It wouldn't be easy. There would be droughts and storms and cattle dying and crops failing and 100 other disasters waiting to happen. But Clara had learned something important in the months since she'd stepped off that train. She'd learned that survival wasn't about avoiding disaster. It was about standing up after disaster knocked you down. It was about looking at a burned barn and deciding to rebuild. It was about finding people who saw you at your worst and chose you anyway. The frontier didn't forgive weakness. It didn't hand out second chances. But if you were stubborn enough, if you refused to break no matter how hard it tried to break you, it would let you stay. And that was all Clara had ever wanted. A place to stay. A place to belong. A place to be enough exactly as she was. She'd found it in the last place she'd expected. In a man who'd forgotten how to hope. In a boy who'd forgotten how to trust. In a land that demanded everything and promised nothing. But she'd found it. And she wasn't letting go. 3 years later, Clara stood in the doorway of the new barn and watched Coulter and Levi work together, mending a broken saddle. Levi was 11 now, tall and lanky, all elbows and attitude. He argued with Coulter about the best way to fix the leather, and Coulter argued back, and Clara smiled because this was what family sounded like. Messy and imperfect and real. The ranch had grown. They'd hired 2 hands, bought more land, doubled the herd. It still wasn't easy. There were still droughts and debts and days when Clara wondered if they'd make it through. But they always did, because they'd learned how to be stubborn together. Clara walked across the yard to the garden. It was bigger now, full of tomatoes and beans and squash. She picked a ripe tomato and bit into it, the juice running down her chin. It tasted like summer and sweat and hard work. Levi came running over, breathless. "Clara, Pa says we can ride out to the north pasture tomorrow. Can you come?" "I've got work to do." "Please?" Clara looked at his face. Eager, hopeful, still a little uncertain that good things would last. She understood that feeling. She lived with it every day. "Okay," she said. "I'll come." Levi whooped and ran back to tell Coulter. Clara watched him go, and then she looked out at the land. The hills rolled away toward the horizon, gold and green and endless. The sky stretched overhead, so big it made her dizzy. She thought about this girl who'd arrived here with $14 and a broken heart. That girl had believed someone else could make her whole. She'd been wrong. No one could do that. You had to make yourself whole, piece by piece, out of the wreckage of everything that tried to destroy you. Clara had done that. She'd built a life out of nothing. She'd turned betrayal into strength, loss into resilience, fear into courage. She wasn't perfect. She still had days when the old hurts resurfaced, when she questioned everything, when she wanted to run. But she didn't run. She stayed. Because staying was the bravest thing she'd ever done. Coulter came up beside her, slipping his arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "How far we've come." "It's been a hell of a ride. It's not over yet." "No," Coulter said, pulling her close. "It's not." Clara leaned into him and watched the sun sink toward the hills. The land was still harsh. The work was still endless. The future was still uncertain. But she had this man, this boy, this place that had forged all three of them into something stronger than they'd been alone. The frontier had tried to break her, but she'd refused to break. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. She'd survived. She'd built something. She'd found a family where there shouldn't have been one. And she'd learned that sometimes the life you need is the one that looks nothing like the life you planned. That night, after supper, Clara found a package on the kitchen table. It was wrapped in brown paper, tied with string. Her name was written on top in Coulter's messy handwriting. "What's this?" she asked. Coulter shrugged. "Open it." Inside was a small brass key. Clara turned it over in her hand, confused. "What's it for?" "The front door. Figured it was time you had your own." Clara stared at the key. It was such a small thing, but it meant everything. It meant this house was hers. This life was hers. Not because someone had given it to her, but because she'd earned it. She looked up at Coulter, and her eyes were wet. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. You earned it." Clara closed her hand around the key and held it tight. Then she set it on the table beside the coffee pot, right next to the sewing basket she'd finished 3 years ago. Two small symbols of a life built from nothing. Levi came into the kitchen, already in his nightshirt. "Are you coming to read?" he asked Clara. "In a minute. Can we finish the chapter about the pioneers?" "We can read whatever you want." Levi grinned and ran off toward his room. Coulter stood and held out his hand to Clara. She took it, and they walked down the hall together. The house was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the moon. Clara stood in the doorway of Levi's room and watched Coulter settle into the chair beside the bed. Levi handed him the book, and Coulter opened it to where they'd left off. Clara leaned against the doorframe and listened to Coulter read. His voice was rough and halting, but it was full of effort, full of love. Levi lay in bed with the quilt pulled up to his chin, his eyes half closed, safe and warm and home. And Clara realized this was the moment, this quiet, ordinary moment. This was what she'd been searching for all along. Not grand gestures, not perfect happiness. Just this, a man reading to his son, a house that kept the cold out, a key that said you belong here. She'd traveled 1,000 miles to find it. She'd been betrayed, abandoned, nearly destroyed. But she'd survived. And in surviving, she'd found something better than the fairy tale she'd imagined back in Philadelphia. She'd found real life, hard and messy and full of work, but also full of laughter and warmth and people who loved her not despite her flaws, but with them. The frontier had taught her that. It had stripped away everything soft and false and showed her what was left underneath. And what was left was strong enough to build on. Clara walked into the room and sat down on the edge of Levi's bed. He reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and trusting. Coulter kept reading, and Clara closed her eyes and let the words wash over her. Tomorrow they'd wake before dawn and work until their bodies ached. They'd fight the land and the weather and the endless demands of survival. They'd argue and struggle and wonder if they were doing anything right, but they'd do it together. And that made all the difference. Because Clara Whitlock had learned the hardest lesson the frontier had to teach. You couldn't wait for life to save you. You had to save yourself. And once you did, once you stood up and refused to break, you could build anything. Even a home. Even a family. Even a future. Out of nothing but dirt and sweat and the stubborn refusal to quit.